Good day, everybody. This is Jim Sloman speaking. Let's go right to our commentary. What causes financial panics? I'm going to make the case today that financial panics are caused by one thing and one thing only: leverage. Too much leverage is the sole cause of financial panics, whether it is a run on a bank, a run on the sovereign debt of a country, a precipitous fall in the stock of a company such as Enron or Lehman Brothers or MF Global, or indeed a stock market crash. An interesting point: financial panics are always preceded by financial bubbles, that is, strong upward markets in money and credit. The panic is caused by the preceding bubble. The former leads to the latter as surely as summer is followed by winter. But what causes the preceding financial bubble? That is caused by too much debt. But what do we mean by too much? The debt becomes too much when it is measured against something such as GDP or national income, that is, the means to service the debt, and the ratio of the debt to the income rises well above its long-term average, such as 2 or 3 times above it, or even more. For example, in the housing bubble of the early to mid-2000s, housing prices rose 3 times in the U.S. above the long-term average of prices to income. Housing prices in the U.S. and many other countries were levitating well above the income to support them and were bound to crash down sooner or later. In the bull market of the 1980s and 1990s, the Fed kept increasing the money supply in response to various crises during that time, such as the Mexican financial crisis, the recession of the early 1990s, the Asian tiger crisis, the long-term capital management crisis, and so on. The money creation in turn fostered a vast expansion in credit and debt creation, which in turn, over time, then tempted some financial institutions to go farther and farther out on a limb, that is, to increase their leverage in order to increase profits. What is leverage? It is the amount of debt in proportion to the capital base that supports it. For example, let's take the long-term capital management crisis. Its founders and partners were a collection of PhD rock stars in the financial world. Their equations were so precise, or so they thought, that they could calculate risk out to 3 decimal places. Because risk was so calculable, they increased their leverage more and more until, just before the end, their leverage was 40 to 1. That is, they had positions in the markets 40 times larger than their capital base. This meant, of course, that they could make gargantuan profits. But at a leverage of 40 to 1, it only takes a drop of 2.5% in the positions to give a gigantic hangover and wipe out the capital base. And given the long-tail propensities of markets, that is, that they are more unpredictable than they seem to be, that is what happened to long-term capital management. Interestingly enough, that same ratio is what sunk MF Global, the recent bankruptcy of the large futures and commodities firm. It made bets on European debt, and over time drove its leverage up to that same number, 40 to 1. It had $6.1 billion in bets on European debt, supported by a minuscule capital base of about $150 million. Why? To make terrific profits. Instead, the firm sunk under the weight of its leverage. Now here's the interesting part. The gargantuan investments of MF Global never lost money. In fact, they were profitable. But as MF Global's fantastic leverage became known, the market lost confidence in it anyway, and its funding dried up. That is, lenders who were loaning MF Global the $6 billion to make its bets became alarmed at the extreme risk that MF Global was taking and pulled the plug. So there's an example of a financial entity whose leverage sank it even though its positions were making money. In other words, it's about the leverage. It's the leverage that matters. And so it has been with other celebrated flameouts. Both Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers had leverage in excess of 30 to 1 just prior to their failures. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had leverage in excess of an astounding 60 to 1 before their failures and subsequent bailout by taxpayers to the tune of over $150 billion so far, with much more to come in the future. Often the leverage is hidden off the balance sheet for a while, as was the case with both Enron and MF Global. But the leverage is deadly, whether hidden or revealed. The financial crash of 1929 and subsequent years was caused by a huge amount of leverage built up in the 1920s. In those days, stocks could be bought on 10% margin, meaning 10 to 1 leverage right off the bat. But in addition, the new investment trusts and other financial entities often borrowed money to buy the stocks, increasing their leverage to, you guessed it, 30 to 1 or more. Similarly, it is impossible to have a bank run unless a bank has too much leverage, that is, loans and other liabilities more than 10 times their depositor and equity cash on hand. Amazingly, some banks have had leverage of 30 to 1 or more, such as the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, and some banks have even had an eye-popping leverage exceeding 100 to 1, where they had less than a penny on hand for each dollar loaned out in loans. You can guess what happened to them. And so it goes. The many European banks in trouble now all have excessive leverage, always for the same reason, of course: increased profits and therefore increased bonuses until the game is up. We're not even talking about the astronomical amounts of derivatives between financial institutions, now estimated at somewhere between $700 trillion, that's with a T, and $1 quadrillion, more than 14 times the economic product of the entire world, and much of which is completely cloaked in darkness. When this unfathomable hidden mountain deleverages, which it almost certainly will at some point, it will create an unstoppable tsunami of debt destruction, which will very likely be followed by astronomical sums of money creation by the world's central banks to stop it, an effort which, in my opinion, will not and cannot succeed, but which will add hyperinflation to the deep worldwide depression.